Welcome to the Incubate podcast, where we feature ordinary people doing extraordinary things.
Hello and welcome to yet another exciting edition of the Incubate podcast, where we are telling the Eswatini story online. My name is Charlton Sozo, and today I have an exciting guest who is the Queen of African Indigenous Knowledge Systems, who is a scholar, a doctor of education, and who's also an African futurist. I am pleased and I'm honored today to be hosting Dr. Joy Ndwandwe. Ndwandwe, thank you very much for coming to the podcast, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, and to all the viewers, I wish you an enjoyable time when sharing with Dr. Toto.
Thank you very
about my
much.
work. Yes.
It's been exciting. It's been long in coming as well because just recently you're working on finalization of your P.H.D. and that finally happened. Congratulations for that. How does it feel?
It's such a major relief because I took many gambles in that research, particularly in the research methodology, by saying that I didn't write this all by myself, but it was also guided as by ancestors. And when the academy accepted that, I was very excited. But I was nervous before the results came.
No, that's exciting. Maybe just a little bit about your PhD work.
Yes.
What were you working on? What were you researching on?
I was researching on the Abantu migration primarily, looking for Abantu governance, and created the people's sovereignty theory. In essence, I was looking at how we governed ourselves during this migration because it's such a complex and very long extended period of people moving from East Africa, Equatorial Guinea, using many routes to find the indigenous knowledge that helped them cope and populates the Southern Africa region. So that was the most exciting thing. But to find the indigenous knowledge I was looking for, the constitutive rules of that indigenous knowledge, I had to triangulate indigenous people's dignity in North America, Australia, and Africa to get solid rules of what constituted this governance system. So that was exciting.
Wow.
Yeah.
What were some of the highlights? What were some of the key things you found in your study, and how valuable is this to us as Africa at the moment?
You know, most of us believe that we did not have indigenous knowledge that guided us in terms of our dignity, because I was really driven by finding a concept of dignity.
Right.
For instance, how we're predicted in our wars, we just looked at the villains, and yet we had rules. One rule is that of cosmic debt, where we don't kill but wound. And now we're known as the killers, we're the brutalists, and yet this was not necessarily what we were set out to do. We threw spears, but not brutally murder people.
Wow.
And there was a change of that during Mfekane, where King Shaka cuts the spear and it became short. And that's when the brutality. So understanding those kind of things have been a very important part of how we governed and how we transcended a lot of environmental and nature, the ecology, how we maintained peace was also a very important part of the research study, and how we had indigenous leadership and how we dignified the land through the dances and the ceremonies. So that connectivity and how all these ceremonies that we held were actually about our governance, because our governance is land-based.
I find this interesting because, when you look at contemporary African society at the moment, there's been a lot of, the younger generations going into the diaspora, and then a couple of people have pretty much come back home in Africa and things like that. And you have this whole wave of young generation, the Generation X, Y, and even some of the Gen Z at the moment, who are trying to reconnect with their Africanness, both from a spiritual point of view and also from even way of life, even going back to Ubuntu, thinking even of our ways of life, thinking of even the sort of foods that we're eating. So this has been a wave that has been going on, and it's actually going on right across Africa, really, where African children are trying to reconnect with their Africanness. Why would you feel that probably it's important that as Africans we're getting back to reconnecting with our Africanness? What's going on? What do you think is going on?
During my research, what I found was that the systemic negation that happened to our indigenous knowledge, where be it spirituality, governance, foods, cultural technologies that existed then, our diplomacy, the systemic negation that came into Africa made us believe that we had no knowledge. They were broken down. There were the colonialists and the missionaries made it their mission to make sure that it is so negated that it becomes a pipe dream to try and connect it with it. So seeing the young children who have been raised with a fundamental question now of why. I think one of the things in this generation that you're talking about have been enabled within the home environment to ask why. When the previous generations, when you say why, they think you're being stubborn, you are quickly shut down. So this new generation is asking the right questions, why? And in that questions, they are digging deeper and wanting to know more about their indigenous knowledge. They are hungry for knowledge, and therefore this is Africa's time to make sure that this knowledge is available to this generation, because we are the lost generation.
I find it fascinating when you're speaking of our own indigenous technologies. So if you think of even the era of the Stone Age, the era of the Iron Age, we were far ahead as Africa in terms of technological advancement then, before even industrialization in Europe and in America and all of that. Where did it go wrong? When people talk about technology, right now we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution and all of that. And the argument is, or one of the concerns within developmental spaces, Dr. Ndwandwe, is Africa is being left behind. But traditionally, and I'm talking centuries, Africa was always ahead in terms of technological development, while people were still struggling with living in caves and all of that in the Europe and the Americas. We're already quite advanced in terms of iron processing. We're quite advanced in terms of even processing of minerals and things like that. Where did Africa go wrong when you reflect?
When I reflect, is that all of those cultural technologies that existed, and even including inter-Africa trade, by the way, all of the advancement that had happened was systemically negated. And I found through my research that there were 4 tools that were used to erase. It was like erase culture that came in with the systemic negation, a pure agenda that was driven by four tools. One is exclusive and undemocratic policies, such that we couldn't even mine our own minerals. It was a policy, it was excluding, it was undemocratic because we were never consulted. It was just, you have no access to land. And transforming the land into land possession, into land ownership, when we were possessing the land for future generations, we're just custodians. And transforming that thinking also destroyed our ways of thinking and our ways of producing and our ways of advancement. And the other tool that they use is divide and rule. So they took a certain population and they educated it and pit each other against each other. So those who were still holding on to the indigenous knowledges were considered barbaric and uncivilized by the very African elite that had been created. So that divide and rule tool worked extremely well. And the next thing was also the concept of poverty consciousness that came in, because the land grab and the mineral grab, let's admit, it was a very clear indication of how colonialism and missionaries were driven by poverty consciousness. And what do I mean? I mean greed, I mean materialism, and I mean also corruption, because colonialism was a corrupt system, and that's why they took over all these minerals without our active participation. So those, and then lastly was patriarchy. Patriarchy, that is power and dominance. When you find people who've existed for centuries and you arrive and you say, you have no history, and you make them believe they have no history, and you make the elite believe they had no history, that's when you start destroying their sense of being and their sense of thinking. And those are the four pillars of the systemic negation that really destroyed our advancements, and our technologies were put aside. They were not allowed to evolve into what is now called technology. When I say to people there was cultural technologies, they look at me like, what are you talking about? But they did exist. One of them that I should mention is how we dried our indigenous foods. And I have seen models now that have come out of that are using solar so that you maintain the quality. So it is the future. And the foods also were systemically negated because land dispossession was an important part of that systemic negation. So we had no land to grow our own indigenous foods, and we're taken into locations, we're taken into civil servants' quarters of sorts, whether you're a teacher or you're a soldier, and therefore we did not have the space to continue cultivating our indigenous foods. And also the economic drive of the colonial system was cash crop production. So we became consumers essentially because we had no land to produce. So our productivity levels were dropped significantly. Yes.
I'm tempted to already jump into conversations regarding the work that you're doing with the Indigenous Knowledge Hub, because I know you're very passionate as well about issues of encouraging production of indigenous foods, and also not just their production, but also their consumption and their sale as well. So would you be able to tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing with the Hub? What's the vision around this kind of work, and why do you think this kind of work is important at this juncture for Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, the Hub is a product of my P.H.D. So it's a recommendation that it should continue to drive. I should continue driving this integration of indigenous knowledge and modernity, because I love modernity. I don't want to get rid of it, and we are not erasing. We're not in that position to erase culture. So modern culture is part of who we are. So the Hub, the Indigenous Knowledge Hub, is really about taking indigenous science and ancestral knowledge and integrating it with modernity and taking it into the future. So whether it's with regard to education, integrate indigenous knowledge within the education system is what we wish to achieve. Foods, integrate our eating habits, because we're not going to get rid of the modernity that's already served in our table. But let's bring those indigenous foods and vegetables particularly to be part of our staple foods. Because right now, where we found ourselves in this current non-productive but consumption culture that has been created, and we believe it is our culture, but I can tell you right now, it's not indigenous. What is happening to us is that we're eating very poor diets, and we are burdened with obesity, and we're burdened with cancer, and we're burdened with hypertension and diabetics. So in order for us to try and stimulate our health and nutritional system, we've got to go back and integrate those indigenous foods into our diets.
What has been the uptake for the kind of work, the sort of advocacy? I know you're also out there, you present papers, you're in high-level conferences, you're generating, you're thought leading in the integration of our culture, indigenous knowledge, and modernity. What has been the uptake of your philosophy and your drive?
I think the most tricky part is when it comes to the governance side.
Yeah.
Because I'm driving the indigenous governance to be integrated with our current modern system, whatever it takes. I'm not so sold on multi-party, but it's an option. But I promote multi-participatory elections and approaches, because then it becomes more inclusive, and it enables governance to kind of know the ownership and also be able to monitor and make leaders accountable. So I'm more focused on the governance, and it's always very tricky because people think immediately you speak your mouth, open your mouth about indigenous governance, they think you're defending the monarch. And that's such a very linear way of looking at my work. Because the monarchs, sometimes I think they scratch their heads about the level of depth I've gone into, because some of the things have been lost along the way due to interpretation, and also due to the infiltration that happened during the colonial period, is that there are serious toxic elements that need to be weaved out, even in the monarchy system. So I'm not necessarily a pro monarch person, but I present knowledge that could help us in when we say integrate, that would help us rethink what is this that we aspire to do. And I think that is the fundamental tension that I always find, that people are not, I become uncertain because there's a fatigue around all the traditional systems, and I get it. But also, one of the things when I talk about governance, I also bring in the traditional ceremonies, which have been systemically negated. Immediately you say Ingwala, people are thinking negative, umhlanga, negative. And yet, what I'm trying to bring into the table and into the thought leadership space is like, let's rethink. These are all governance that are land-based governance systems. We dance to dignify the land. Umhlanga, we're seeking for the first rains to tilt the land. It's a rain dance. To tend the land, to plow the land, to plant these very indigenous vegetables. That's where it comes from. And also the other aspect of it is that when we go into Ingwala, we're now looking for rain for the growing of the crops, which is a very important part of it. So people are conflicted because this has been so systemically negated. And when I start explaining in public space that going to the ocean, for instance, which is one of the most contentious issues of Ingwala, and I said, no, but we studied this along the Abantu migration. So we understood the great cosmic feed. We understood that in November and December, it's the mating of the corals. People are taken aback. But because they are in that angry space or in that negative space, because the most powerful tool is that systemic negation is such a legacy that's embedded within all of us. So I also negated this before I understood them, and I'm trying to make sure that people get to some level of comfort and understanding how important it is, because these are land-based systems.
I wanted, when you spoke of the 4 pillars, I was also just thinking on issues related to faith, religion, spirituality. What role do you think religion and spirituality played around colonialism on one end? But also right now, it's very interesting. You see a lot of the younger generation, young women, interestingly seeking to reconnect with their African spirituality for whatever reason. Some people have all sorts of theories and all of that. But you also have a lot of questioning that's going on right now, really, around spirituality. Has Africa traditionally been demonic? Has African spirituality been dark? Is African spirituality going to lead us to hell? How do we reconcile the role of faith and religion in terms of the contemporary conversations, even on Africanness itself, African identity, and even the connection with the Christian, the Islamic faiths, and all of that? And did Africans not know the creator before colonialism? And how does this feed into the narrative around African futurism?
I think one of the things that I found in my research is the whole concept of Ntu, which is the supreme being.
Yeah.
So we are Abantu, because I've argued technically in my thesis that we're not Bantus. We are Abantu.
Yeah.
Aba means people of, Ntu,
People of God, people
people
of
of
the
God,
Creator.
people of the Creator.
Wow.
So everything that we've ever done was centered around the Creator who connected us with the nature and the environment. And Ubuntu being I am, because we are all related as children of Mother Earth.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
That is essentially what I picked up as a very strong point. But this other elements had already been dropped off the line by the systemic negation.
Yeah.
So for the young children, I say kudos for them for wanting to advance that thought. But they have to understand that their parents and grandparents will not understand them because these are products of the systemic negation.
Right.
When the missionaries, when that statement, there's a statement that was made in the British Parliament in 1935 that they must destroy all cultural heritage. And missionaries were the first, I call them the advanced party of colonialism, because they brought in the religious aspects with a mission. The mission was clear: land and minerals. Therefore, destroy all their cultural heritage, because these were the pillars of the spirituality. These were the pillars of how societies were really creating a fortress around themselves. So to be able to break them, you had to break the fortress.
Yeah.
So for the children, I would encourage them to do more research. And I also encourage them not to fall into the space of thinking all we were ever about was healing, medicines, and limiting our spirituality to that. I mean, Twasa seems to be how people are expressing, and it must just be one expression. And this is why the Indigenous Knowledge Hub is looking for young people who are spiritually connected but want to integrate it with academic knowledge, which is what my thesis was about. Because I connected with my ancestors without effortlessly on my laptop and the books, and I was guided to the areas of interest that I need to bring into this thesis. So these are the future projects that need to happen. So having all children become traditional healers, I don't think that's a solution. And I also don't think we have the right actually to limit our ancestors to just being producers of herbs. I think they should.
It has always been much deeper than that.
Yes, and contribute to epistemologies and pedagogy. I think that's what I'm driving with the Indigenous Knowledge Hub.
I want then to just take this up to speak a little bit more about the book that you did, Unearthing King Sobhuza II's philosophy. You tell a very interesting story about this amazing book. I think it's one of the most amazing books, and I would encourage viewers to please look for this book on online platforms. It's an incredible book. I've been going through it myself. Tell us a little bit more about the story around this book and the inspiration around it, the spiritual connection around this book and its significance.
Okay. First of all, I was trained at the Institute of Right Brain Research in Montreal, Canada by my late spiritual guru. So I never went for traditional healing school. So I didn't twasa. And this book came as years after I had been to the Institute of Right Brain, because I got a vision of King Sobhuza. And I first read an article in the Nation magazine, and more visions came. So I realized, okay, so it's time for me to start doing this research. So I retired at the age of 42 from urban development, where I was working. And when I sat down and I listened to the speeches, audio speeches, over 200 audio speeches of King Sobhuza, I realized that he was connecting me with my old soul. And it then evolved that I am an old soul Lazite. And therefore I had to do this because Queen Lazite had married King Sobhuza I, King Somhlolo, and birthed King Mswati II. So, and I come from that family. I'm a direct descendant of King Zwide. And Queen Lazidze was King Zwide's daughter. And our family moved to the Kingdom of Swaziland when Queen Lazidze was queen. So I started feeling that King Sobhuza's speeches were evoking a level of depth. And this level of depth is now contextualized as the indigenous knowledge. So this was marking the advent of my understanding that I am an old soul, Queen Lazidze, and that King Sobhuza had been sent to evoke that within me. And therefore these recordings were bringing in a level of depth that I never thought I knew. I just struggled with his intensity of the Swati language, because he spoke Swati that was really early, not what we speak now.
Yeah.
But in terms of understanding and his context, I was really helped by my old soul. And that book is evidence of how, when working with the old souls, we can produce knowledge, because I wrote it posthumously for King Sobhuza.
Wow.
Almost 30 years after his demise.
Wow. That is amazing. And, for me, I think this sort of like epitomizes the whole concept of capturing what those who've gone, before us have been saying, their wise words of wisdom, their philosophies, and being able to capture them in our own books, that our own children and generations that follow will be able to look into. I mean, amazing that you went through King Sobhuza's speeches, over 200 of them, and then from there you continued also to get inspiration as well, in terms of just being able to capture. And we need a lot more of this, I think, when we think of our elders, when we think of our ancestors, and their amazing words. There's quite a lot of work. For instance, I think of someone like Nehanda Nyakasikana from the Zimbabwean era of the first Chimurenga liberation struggle, and a lot of her philosophies around colonialism and the fight, against oppression and all of that. We use that quite a bit in oratory and things like that, but there was not enough documentation of all of that. We hear of the legend of Queen Nzingambande. We hear of her, the heroics and all of that. But these are mostly told through the lenses of the colonialists and all of that. And I wanted to just try and connect this, particularly as I was beginning to talk about, African warriors, she-kings and sheroes, if you want to put them across that way, to say, what is the role of African women spiritualists, African women technical experts and scholars like yourself, in terms of advancing the narrative around where we've come from, indigenous knowledge, the value, blending this with the contemporary discourse around modernization, and also just thinking about, African futurism. What role do powerful women like yourself, Dr. Joy, have in terms of getting this narrative corrected and also advancing the African narrative going forward?
Thank you. I think one of the things I stand for is to rewrite this context. And we say it so boldly and so that the death of an elder is the end of resources material. We say the library, a library has died when an elder lives, and I think my spirituality says no. It's just being transcended into another space, and if we allow our children to contextualize when they appear to them, where that it is not for medicines only, but it's also for knowledge. Then we will not have a library dying when an elderly statesperson dies.
That's key.
African women, I think I tell a very interesting story by saying I'm an old soul Lazidze, because most people don't know her story. And when the first missionaries came, they didn't like her. She was too strong. They were shocked. And I'm talking about in the 1800s epochs when we didn't have Queen Elizabeth. So they were so taken aback about how this was a formidable queen that was well respected because she was regent then when they arrived. And she was regent for her son, King Mswati II. And after his demise, she was regent for her grandson, King Manzini. So when you talk about that, bringing that back into the public space, I was talking to a friend and asking, do you have a picture of Queen Lizzie? He says, she's before the cameras. So here we are. I'm sitting here today and affirming her thoughts because she anchored the indigenous knowledge from the Kingswide family into this country.
Wow.
So when you talk about Ingwala and all of these intricate processes, she brought that in here.
Wow.
So I bring that into her space. We cannot even find a picture or an image. We're bringing it. We're bringing her thoughts. We're bringing her courage. We're bringing her transformative energy. We're bringing her integration of the existing, because she didn't destroy the existing Swati indigenous knowledge, but she enriched a lot of sections. And she led this country during very difficult times. Wars were happening, and she was leading. She was a very formidable character within this kingdom. So her psyche, but she's not recorded. Instead, we talk more about Queen Lobatsibeni because she was recorded by the British. So and I always think about my favorite in Zimbabwe, for instance, is the whole indigenous prophets of the Zvikiros.
Yes.
And I think this energy has to come back. These old souls need to be evoked amongst these young children. And maybe some of the ones that are looking into spirituality are actually part of that. We will never know until they write their honors papers, until they write their master's papers, until they write their doctorates. Because I'm more confident to talk about who I am in the past right now because I have completed the P.H.D. and I've argued. So I think this is why work like the Indigenous Knowledge Hub, partnering with the existing university, where I become the broker of saying, allow them. Fortunately, methodologically, it is possible to do this work now. And it comes from a concept of self-referencing. So no libraries are burning, no libraries are dying, because we can have children who connect to the old souls to bring that through self-referencing and bringing them within current methodologies that are there.
Wow. That is really amazing. I am fascinated by the sort of work that you are doing, and also the connection with the contemporary discourse, and also just thinking also about the future. I think it's totally amazing. If you're going to be asking me, I have one more issue I wanted to just ask, and it's about I like the way you're proud and the way you demonstrated, in the way that you also dress and all of that. What happens when you go to international conferences and when you're speaking internationally? Do people look at you weird, or your assertion of your pride in the way that you dress? And also, I've sat in one or two platforms where you have also spoken as well, and you're a very eloquent poet and all of that. Where does this come from? Is this part of who you are? I was amazed at one space where you were speaking and you just broke into poetry and storytelling before you came up. How does that work?
I think everybody has lots of gifts. I mean, one of mine is, as I evolve with lots of gifts. There's the singing voice too.
Wow.
That there's, everybody has layers and layers of how their spirituality evolves. But it also takes about readiness. Are you ready to actually step into that space?
Right.
Okay. my traditional regalia
Yeah.
is my brand. It's
Wow.
my business suit.
Wow.
I wear it. It is not indigenous.
Yeah.
Because all of this, it is put together by non-indigenous material.
Right.
So it's modernity. So this is where it's integrated. But
Right.
everything here is the symbolism
Wow.
of the indigenous.
Wow.
So we are fully integrated in the indigenous and modernity because
Amazing.
the design is
Yeah.
modern,
Yeah.
the design
Yeah.
is indigenous, but the fabric and all of this are all really modern
Yeah.
artifacts.
Yeah.
So it makes one feel indigenous,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily indigenous.
Yeah.
And that's the tension that
Okay.
we must carry into the space.
Yeah.
I did a project in the UK with schools, and it was cold, and I insisted on wearing it.
Wow.
And some of the kids were asking me when I got to class, because I was talking about Ubuntu, they said, "Is this an Ubuntu dress?
Yeah.
If I dress like you, will it make me feel like
Yeah.
Ubuntu? Will I understand Ubuntu?" But that's a tension. That's
Yeah.
already rethinking there.
Yeah.
That's the tension it brings.
Yeah.
And I think it also becomes an upset that
Yeah.
I carry around with me. Because here I am looking very traditional in that podium, and then I don't speak
Yeah.
like a traditional person
Yeah.
because I've lived in a few countries.
Yeah.
So my whole intonation and accent becomes, "Oh, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Why?" But
Yeah.
that's the upset, because we are basically saying the colonialism brought us to be able to function in the international space. But you know what? We can still be rooted in our own
can still-
indigenous context.
Wow.
And that's integrating indigenous knowledge and modernity.
That's amazing. As we close, Dr. Joy, what is your word to, parents who have young children, and what would be your word of encouragement to them regarding embracing of our African identity and blending this with modernity? That's on one end. On the other, I'm also just thinking about African governments themselves, at the place where we are as a continent. We are asking ourselves questions around the future of Africa. We're asking ourselves questions around the sustainable development goals. There's so much concern around sustainability. There's so much concern about food security and all of that. I think, or more of this, I think, then just compelling us or taking us straight back to be thinking about how our elders, Abu Dalawetu, and all in the past, how did they used to do it? How do we sustain our societies going forward and all of that? What would be your word to African governments around issues of sustainability, thinking of Africanness and going ahead? But maybe before you touch on that, just begin by issues around family, to say, as we're thinking of the younger generations that are coming up, what would you say to families and communities? And then what would be your word in parting short to African governments?
Thank you. Families.
Yeah.
I'm a mother and a grandmother.
Yeah.
And I always say to children, teach you how to be a mother.
Yeah.
Children teach you how to be a family.
Yeah.
And listen very deeply to their rebellion. Because
Yeah.
behind that rebellion, there is a profound soul that's screaming to be heard and listened to. And when you do take time, listen to them deeply. Because in that depth, you will find that you are actually a chosen mother to bring a wonderful soul from the past, to bring that knowledge into that space. That rebellious voice is an old voice. My parents struggled with me, and I know what it's like, because I just always had a big voice, and they felt I was displacing their authority, but that big voice came from an ancient space. I was actually older than my parents spiritually. So you can imagine.
Yeah.
So you don't know who you've given birth to in the house. Okay.
Yeah.
And I watch my granddaughter and my daughter sometimes, and I'm like, who are these guys? But they're not ready to go there.
Okay.
So let's evolve with our children.
Yeah.
African governments, please understand one thing.
Yeah.
Modern governments were never meant for 100% of the population.
Yeah.
And you will always struggle achieving service delivery. until you accept that these institutions we inherited from the colonial systems are not rooted in the indigenous context. And I'm saying that because it becomes an inspirational story of how we are the generations that can then sit as think tanks and as independent thought leaders and see how we can integrate these institutions that are not accountable to people. Because they were never set up like that. I think that's one thing we have to have an honest conversation. Governments that we inherited were never set up to be accountable, to be owned by the people. They don't have the discipline to do that. They don't have the discipline to deliver a service. So when we start going into the indigenous governance systems, we will find how we can anchor that ownership, that discipline, and that accountability that we can integrate into these governments. It's not too late. We can still do it. But we also need to have our public policy specialists trained, and they must understand that they are struggling. Part of their struggle is because it's not integrated in the indigenous systems. On the issue of United Development SDGs, Sustainable Development, one of the things that came out clearly in my thesis is that we will forever have this SDGs because we left the indigenous knowledge behind. We left the context of who we are. So we kind of like go into the government space or the development space without ourselves, without our context. We go in as physical bodies, as intellectuals that are out of context. And this is why our planning systems are never fully integrated towards the human that we are now saying SDGs, leave no one behind. We can't say leave no one behind when we've left our own indigenous context. And lastly, Africa Union has Agenda 2063. It became very obvious during my research that the reason why we have Agenda 2063 is that we have left this indigenous context behind. So my final word to the African governments, let's get the integration of indigenous knowledge in our governance systems that exist so that we can start having a different kind of leader and a different kind of institution that is not going to leave anybody behind. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joy. Critical parting shot for me there is not just about looking at indigenous knowledge systems in isolation, but it is about integration with African contemporariness and also relevance to changes that are going on around us. So we can only start envisaging the future when we think about how we integrate where we've come from and the contemporary discourses. This has been amazing on two fronts for me. One of them is that we've been talking about your research work and then its practical application and also its practical transformation into the hub, which is the current work that you're currently doing and growing. And then also just going a little bit deeper as well into some of your passion around spirituality as well as perspective on where you think some of our African governments are actually failing in terms of the broader developmental discourse. And I love the way you connected the Agenda 2063 conversation with also the conversation on the Sustainable Development Goals. This has been an amazing conversation. Dr. Joy, thank you very much for coming to the show. And it's always a great privilege to have these kinds of conversations going on. Folks, if you like what you have seen today, please don't forget to go and subscribe on our page, Incubate Podcast. You will find us on YouTube. Please like, please share. And meet us at the next episode. My name is Charlton Sozo. It has been an amazing, amazing time. Thank you for joining us as we continue to tell the story of Eswatini online.
Thank you.
Are we good, Tawanda?